Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pratt. I am the peacemonger, wherever you are in the world, whether your nationality, religion, race, or sexual preference, anything. I wish you very much peace. Today is the 4th anniversary of the devastating, quite frankly, war in Ukraine, something that everybody should be striving with every sinew to end, and yet which, it seems to me at least, many people in the West want to continue. And there are a whole host of reasons why they may want it to continue. An obvious one is to try and inflict in some abstract way a strategic defeat on Russia. Though it never, at no point really since 2014 when the Ukraine crisis first started, has that ever looked remotely likely. And it looks no more likely today. Russia's economy is in a stronger position than the economies of Europe. That's not necessarily to say that it's in a vibrant and healthy state. Everybody knows that Russia's suffering from high rates of inflation. The interest rates have had to go up. Growth has slowed. But to be completely honest, I mean, I could have said exactly the same thing in November of 2014 while I was sitting in the British Embassy in Moscow watching Russia and the rest of the world endure a massive collapse in global oil prices, after a period of post-global financial crisis, high rates of oil at over $100 to the barrel. Suddenly they halved, the ruble plummeted in value, inflation went up, interest rates massively went up. Everybody was saying, well, gosh, isn't Russia's economy going to implode at any moment? It didn't implode. And the reason it didn't implode was because at the top of the financial architecture in Russia, there are some very capable people, and those people still continue to govern the economic and monetary policy of Russia to this day. I talk about it on a regular basis, not because I owe them any favors, just because it's true. And that's Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank governor of the Bank of Russia. She was actually Putin's economic advisor in the presidential administration before being promoted into that job, a job that she's done very well. She's been voted the Central Bank of the Year before. Certainly, while I was based in Moscow, that was the case. Anton Siluanov, the finance minister, again, high school of education, economics trained, very, very well regarded, has been in that job at least since I was posted to the British Embassy in Moscow at the back end of 2014. And together, this double act make a powerful pairing of liberals, believe it or not, within the Russian system, who have helped Russia to navigate through the economic headwinds of the 2014 oil price collapse, the 2016 oil price collapse, the COVID and the massive shock that was involved in that, the onset of war. They've overseen the massive buildup of international reserves since the back end of 2016 to really help Russia absorb the shock. They've been involved in making sure that the Russian sovereign wealth fund, is kept stocked up, as well, and the National Welfare Fund, which they use basically as a shock absorber whenever big economic shocks, come in. These people have been kind of steering the ship, and they've been doing it quite well. That's not to say that Russia's economy is in perfect shape. It clearly isn't. I mean, this is a country that is of 143 million people that has had to endure 4 years of war at a massive economic cost, but also a cost in human lives. Obviously, they don't oversee that, but they seem to be navigating it far better from the European Union and from the United Kingdom. And the reason for that is, in the European Union, and as I've said very, very many times already, there is no consistency in policy making. Not only do the finance ministers and central bank governors change on a more sort of regular basis, it will always be the case that Europe has to kind of try and marshal 27 competing national interests into a single economic, policy. And that will never, ever be as agile as what Russia can do as a sovereign nation, even as a sovereign nation that by population size is 4 times smaller than, the EU as a whole. By economic weight is, by nominal terms rather than PPP, 10 times smaller than the EU as a whole. They have the sovereign ability to decide, and that gives them an advantage in terms of navigating exogenous economic shocks, including from from war. So hence, in some of the data points you see that through, in particular, for example, international reserve positions. Russia's international reserves took an absolute hammering at the back end of 2014. When the oil price first collapsed at that time, because Russia had really, since the end of the global financial crisis, sort of pegged, the ruble to dollar rate at around 30, 35 kind of rubles to the dollar to give them kind of fiscal predictability at a time of high oil prices. And of course, when the oil prices collapsed, they couldn't maintain that peg, although they still went through about 2 months of trying to maintain the peg under pressure from sort of economic hawks in Russia that insisted on just selling off rubles to kind of prop up the currency. But of course, what that meant was that they burned through $100 billion of international reserves in the space of a month. Quickly figured out that approach wasn't working. And again, Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank governor, she called a meeting after what's commonly known as Black Tuesday, in Moscow, when they basically had the first big financial collapse in December of 2014, totally changed the policy. They ditched, the currency peg. They ramped up, interest rates initially, I think, to about 27%, although they brought it down progressively after that. They changed to this kind of approach of inflation targeting. And that really set the tone for how Russia's economic and sort of monetary policy continued to be managed. They're looking ahead. As events unfold, they're adapting to them. They're adjusting their policy as they go along. That has allowed them to build considerable resilience. Including during a period of war. So we have today a sort of a situation of war that has existed for 4 years now, sadly. Back in November 2014, Russia's international reserves had plummeted to about 400 billion, which, don't get me wrong, is still big. It was still big then, by international standards. As of today, Russia's international reserves sit, and I just checked this morning on the Russian central bank website, and it's actually, they have very good and reliable data sets. In my experience, the Russians are many things, but they tend to be really honest with their data. Their international reserve position sits at $833 billion. And that's all their own money that they've kind of gathered. And they've been purposefully gathering their reserves in the preparation for war, knowing the risks of it breaking out, in February of 2022, and since the war started. European nations, the US, the UK, expropriated $300 billion of their assets at the start of the war. That blew a great big hole, in their kind of international reserve positions in terms of the liquidity that was available to them at that time. They navigated that shock by starting to buy gold. We've seen progressively this big rush into kind of gold as a kind of safe haven, really, for international investors. Since the war started, not just in Russia but in China, ever since the war started, pretty much all of Russia's kind of surplus reserves have gone into gold purchases, which now make up around almost just under one half of Russia's total reserve position of 833 billion kind of US dollars. And they've done that precisely to insulate themselves from the risk of further expropriation, through kind of Western sanctions, and so on. Again, thinking ahead, responding to events, steering the ship and navigating through and continuing to be in a stronger position, than their adversaries, which is basically us, the British, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, right now, who are engaged in a kind of a policy of economic warfare against them at the moment. So this is how the Russians kind of adapt and navigate with very competent people at the top. We can't say that we have the same, here in the West, I'm afraid to say. And what we've seen, over the past 2 days has been a complete charade in which European nations have tried to impose yet another round of economic sanctions, against Russia, 20th round of sanctions. And if you go through the detailed list of the sanctions, Ursula von der Leyen wrote a letter on the 9th of February, which you can look up if you're struggling to sleep at night and need something to send you off to sleep. And, it's an extensive list, but it's, as the 20th package, it's really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel of the options that are available to the EU to impose on Russia. First thing, I mean, if it gets to 20 rounds of sanctions and this is still not having an effect, on Russia, one has to ask, actually, is the sanctions, policy working at all? I mean, I would argue, in fact, that sanctions hit diminishing marginal returns pretty soon after the war actually started in February of 2022. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that Russia, as I've said before, had spent the preceding 8 years adapting to the sanctions that were first imposed in 2014. They had 8 years, to prepare and adjust to living with sanctions. That included a big pivot towards Asia, obviously massively increasing trade with China, then massively increasing all trade with India followed, and so on. They had all that time to prepare. And the first salvos that were fired from Europe and the UK and the US, after the war started, were the biggest possible sanctions that could be imposed at that time. Think about that for a moment. You had the swift imposition of sanctions, which is kind of limiting Russia's access to the kind of swift messaging system for financial transactions, which, when I was in Moscow in 2014, was always considered the nuclear option. And obviously did have a short-term effect in terms of the ability of Russian banks to conduct financial transactions. That's absolutely true. But by the same token, Russia had been starting to build its own new financial sort of architecture using the mere kind of payment system starting from the back end of 2014. And actually, the SWIFT ban is also accelerated across the developing world, including in the context of BRICS alternative payment vehicles. So these days, SWIFT, for example, is seen as actually out of date compared to the new kind of cross-border payment transaction systems that have been putting in place. So again, what was considered a nuclear sanctions option back in 2014 has actually become, symbolic, totemic for the Europeans in doing it, but increasingly actually kind of irrelevant in terms of its impact on Russia's ability to trade. And when Ursula von der Leyen says that actually, Russia's all our exports in 2025 were down by 24%. That's actually defying the real numbers, because if you look at Russia's export numbers, they've proved remarkably resilient throughout the course of the war. So in 2025, for example, Russia's exports topped in at about $413.4 billion US dollars. And I think it was slightly higher in 2024, is about $429 billion. But I mean, the difference was about 3.3% marginal, 3.3% difference, which is very much in the kind of margin of error. None of this suggests a catastrophic collapse in Russia's ability to actually export goods. 4 years into the war, they've been able to kind of navigate because they can export goods freely to China, to India, and to countries in the developing world. They have the financial transaction processing systems that allow them to do that. They're navigating, the turbulence that's been caused by sanctions, and so on. And so, Russia's current account surplus. I mean, Russia hasn't really had a full year current account deficit really since I think about 1998, the year of their sovereign default, to the IMF. I mean, that they've made it a policy principle always to export more than they import, and that has not changed since the war started. In fact, when the war started in 2022, the first year of the war, Russia recorded its biggest ever current account surplus of I think over 200 billion US dollars surplus. They exported more than 200 billion more in 2022 than they imported. Surplus. That all went into their international reserve positions. The reason that they were able to do that is the very reason that people in the European circuit kind of celebrate. The ruble collapsed. People say, oh, if you watch mainstream media, oh look, the ruble has collapsed. Look how well sanctions are working. Well, no, actually, the Russians love it when the ruble collapses, because what that means is that the ruble-denominated value of a barrel of oil shoots up. So say for example, you've got $1,000 worth of oil, and you're charging 71 rubles for that. I'm just totally making up numbers as I go along. And so you got 71,000 rubles for that oil. And then suddenly the ruble rate goes up to, the ruble rate against the dollar shrinks to 142, to the dollar, and everybody in Europe, celebrates that. Well, suddenly actually the Russians have twice the number of rubles. They've got 14,200 rubles for their oil. And this is what I mean. A collapsing ruble is actually, has tended to be good and has been seen as a virtue by the Russian state right back to the back end of 2016. When they shifted towards an explicitly kind of weak ruble, economic policy in Russia, for example. And of course, the reason in 2022 that actually they got such a massive current account surplus was because at the same time that the ruble was tanking in value against the US dollar, the value of oil was absolutely going through the roof. So you got a double whammy. You're getting oil prices at well above 100 to the barrel. I mean, I forget what it finally topped out at, but it was seriously high. As we all know, we all suffered the kind of energy price increases in Western economies, because of that, at a time when the ruble was tanking. So, if your ruble halves in value and the oil price doubles in value, therefore you're getting 4 times as many rubles for every barrel of oil sold. I mean, that's just basic mathematics, right? That's basic mathematics. And that helps to explain why actually kind of at the start of the war, while EU nations, the US, the UK, were pumping billions into Ukraine to fund the war effort, Russia was raking in billions from the oil trade, and that is just a basic fact of economics. And of course, Europe has tried to cut off its import of Russian oil and gas since the war started. But by that time, Russia already spent several years navigating its oil and gas exports towards Asia anyway. So whereas in 2014, when there's like a 45% dependency on Russia for energy, I mean, at the back end of 2024, it's only 12% of Europe's gas imports were from Russia. Actually, Russia was already exporting most of its energy east and not west. And so, the kind of, the sanctioning of Russia by cutting off imports of oil and gas, while, totemic, again, for the Europeans, has actually harmed the Europeans more than it's harmed, the Russians, because the Russians had adapted, and actually the Europeans have decided to import more expensive energy as a result, as an article of policy. As an article of policy, they've chosen to, buy, LNG, from the US at twice, at least twice, the price of piped Russian, gas, and because they hardly get any piped Russian gas anymore because they shut the pipelines. They've decided to, buy more expensive Russian LNG to account for the 12% of gas they get from Russia. So, as an article of policy, they're choosing to buy more expensive Russian gas than to pipe cheaper Russian gas, because pipelines are kind of politically symbolic, and we can't be having those in Europe. It's just total bonkers. It's economic bonkers, and we've seen in Germany have lost over 250,000 industrial jobs since 2019, according to one report, about 4.3% contraction in the kind of industrial labor force, basically because factories are closing left, right, and center because energy prices are too high, and that sort of thing. And all the time, Russia's economy keeps rumbling forward. So we get to the European Council meeting yesterday, and the Hungarians dig a line in the sand and say, well, we're not going to agree to this. We're not going to agree to this 20th sanctions package, and we're not going to agree because, as Gladden Papin is the American president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, said on X, if the Hungarians, choose not to import oil and gas, from Russia, the first thing that will happen will be that the cost of gasoline, petrol, at Hungarian filling stations will double. The cost of living of, ordinary goods for Hungarians will double or triple, overnight. German investment into Hungary, because the Germans aren't investing in Germany anymore because the energy is too expensive. So they're starting to shift their investment to places like Hungary. The Germans will stop investing in Hungary because suddenly Hungarian cost of energy is the same as the German cost of energy, which is too high for them to invest. So they'll go further afield, and that will collapse the government over, within 2 or 3 weeks, I think he said. And so, the Hungarians are saying, well, we're not going to do that. I mean, they've got an election coming up on April the 12th. It's hotly contested. Obviously, the Eurocrats want the opposition party to win. The Eurocrats want, to kind of manipulate the elections in Hungary so that the party wins that is most in favour of their kind of, economically suicidal kind of policies, towards Russia. And Fidesz is saying, well, no, sorry, but we're, actually that. Signing up to a 20th sanctions package is political. It's not just economic suicide for Hungary; it's political suicide for us. And if you've met many politicians in your life, obviously, most politicians, at least I hope, are driven by a need to kind of serve their country and their people, but also driven by a need for personal survival as well in a political sense. There's no way that Viktor Orban's party was going to sign up to this sanctions package with an election just around the corner, given the economic consequences and therefore the political consequences that could have for him. So we got to a standoff in the European Council meeting yesterday in Brussels, with Ukrainian journalists kind of hijacking Peter Szijjártó, the kind of Hungarian foreign minister, saying, why don't you like Ukraine? Well, it's got nothing to do with that. It's like why do Hungarians choose Hungarians first? That's because they're putting their national interest first, and that's what this is all about. And unfortunately, sanctions have become a tool to completely, depart from the individual national interests of member states. Unfortunately, that they are. I had a separate discussion with a good friend of mine, Philip Pilkington, which will probably air tomorrow. Who's actually based in Hungary. Sanctions have become pure self-harm. For Europeans, for European citizens who have to kind of deal with the high energy prices, these are not conditions that are affecting Russia as badly. Yes, Russia has inflation, high interest rates, and the same things that we're talking about in 2014. But the economic headwinds facing Europeans are far harsher. And so, quite frankly, I celebrate the Hungarians' decision to take a stand yesterday at the European Council meeting. Unfortunately, the British haven't chosen to do the same. They've now imposed the biggest ever sanctions package against Russia since the war started. And I was involved in, for my sins, the sanctions that they imposed on Russia, after the war started in February 2022, while still a serving member of the diplomatic service. A massive new bunch has come in now. And I'm thinking to myself, well, am I going to be next? I'm talking out against sanctions. One of the organizations sanctioned is Imedi TV, who is based in Georgia, because apparently they're involved in disinformation. They're not. From all my dealings with Imedi TV, they spend all their time trying to have as little kind of direct contact with anybody with the Russian influence as they possibly can, and yet they've now been sanctioned, and so I therefore can't do any work with them, it seems, because if I do, then I might be sanctioned. I've written all these articles over the past couple of years since I left the diplomatic service, criticizing sanctions policy, criticizing Western policy towards Russia, purely in the interest of kind of securing peace for this country that has been totally devastated by war. Is that now putting me at risk of being sanctioned because I've said that? Is free speech so repressed now in Europe that me, the person who authorized half of the UK sanctions against Russia, might be sanctioned? It's frankly terrifying. It's terrifying because of, you look at people like Jacques Baud and Natalie Yam and others, in Europe who've already been sanctioned, and it's. There are just so many consequences to it. There's obviously the financial. You suddenly can't operate, within your own society because your bank accounts have been frozen. But there's also the reputational. How do you survive that? What do you say to your kids when you've been sanctioned? I criticise government policy, therefore our bank accounts are frozen and all your kids will be pointing you at school because your daddy's been sanctioned. How do you even try to explain that away. I mean, I don't even know the answer to that. So it's terrifying, but I think that is probably one of the reasons, that they're doing it. It has this kind of chilling effect. They want to have a chilling effect on free speech, that people will be so scared to speak out, about the kind of, taking a completely evidence-based, view on the effectiveness of Western policy towards the Ukraine war, which I've said consistently has been a complete failure, that is actually failing European citizens more than it's failing Russia, that isn't leading to a strategic defeat. I mean, these for me, I mean, you might say that's my opinion, but these are what I see as the objective realities of the situation we find ourselves in today, based on the evidence I've looked at extensively. Whenever I'm writing an article, for example, for responsible statecraft, it's always very well researched. It's always referenced and so on. I'm not just making stuff up as I go along. I spent 4.5 years at the British Embassy in Moscow writing economic reports to ministers, which were often, I suspect, probably not very read, saying that sanctions weren't that effective at the time. I'm not just making crap up as I go along, guys. I mean, this is what, that we may ultimately come down. This is my judgment of the evidence before me, but it's still a judgment based on evidence. This is not by its definition disinformation. This is a judgment based on the evidence, and I continue to believe that my judgments put me on the right side of history. That actually, Ukraine, there is no route for Ukraine to win this war. There never has been, short of a more general war with Europe, which would have devastating consequences for the citizens of Europe, which absolutely nobody, should ever hope to see happen. So, the only less bad outcome from the situation we find ourselves in today is to bring the war to an end. And unfortunately, European leaders again today, virtue signaling their way through Kiev, with Zelensky having lots of photo ops and soundbite moments as they go, including Alistair Campbell with the ghastly kind of ex-post from Maidan Square. I've been to Maidan Square, a very impressive place, don't get me wrong, but they're just talking about the same thing. Oh, well, we want a ceasefire and Russia doesn't want a ceasefire. No, Russia wants, for there to be a real conversation about the underlying root causes of the conflict in the first place. The big one being the expansion of NATO. If you're not prepared to have diplomacy is about dialogue over tough choices, and the underlying root cause of this war is arguably, and as has been spoken about, not just for 4 years, but for almost 29 years since George Kennan did his first article in the New York Times. The author of the US containment policy against the Soviet Union. He warned about this in 1997 and again in 1998. We've been talking about this, and yet we still rumble on trying to do the same thing over again, hoping for a different result, which my recollection is what is misattributed to Albert Einstein as being the definition of insanity. I actually don't believe that Einstein said it, but people seem to attribute it to him. I don't know why. This war only ends when there's a deal, and that deal is something that the Americans have been trying to kind of moderate since Trump has come to power, and Trump has many failings, which I've spoken about, very often. But the only way out of this is a deal, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the British in particular are doing everything they can to prevent a deal from happening. And as part of that effort, they're kind of repressing free speech. They're repressing my free speech. I mean, do I have to worry that somebody's going to knock on my door, that I'm going to be arrested for looking at the analysis and writing reports, on my Substack, talking on X? Is that what I have to worry about next? I mean, come on, guys. I mean, this can't be right. And actually, this just makes me more determined to continue to speak out. Am I going to be like Richard Sackwell and George Galloway and Lord Robert Skidelsky, who get interrogated at Heathrow Airport for 4 hours under counterterrorism powers simply because I've written an article saying that our policy is rubbish? I mean, are we living in the new Soviet Union here, guys, or what's happening? This is ridiculous. So that's the sad state we find ourselves in today. Today, I'm genuinely worried that I might be sanctioned next. And and really starting to think about whether I continue this venture or just, I don't know, set up a fruit and veg stall in the market. I don't know, do something else. Don't know what I'm trained to do. I've got a novel coming out in the summer. Please buy it. Help me. I'm being repressed by my own government. I don't know what to do. But still, here we are, fourth anniversary of the war. Absolutely, everyone is talking about, in Kiev today about, oh, no one wants, the war to end more than Ukraine. Well, then make it end. Sit down around the table with Russia, strike a deal. A deal won't be easy. Diplomatic negotiations are never easy. But the Europeans just have to stay out of the way and let the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians hammer out a deal. And it will be painful. It will involve concessions. It will involve concessions on every side. But that is the nature of diplomacy, guys. Live with it. Stop repressing people talking out about the idiocy of this policy. It's ridiculous and actually incredibly stressful for people like me. Because, 2 million people dead or injured so far in this terrible war. Think about their parents. Think about those people who are mutilated, lost legs, limbs, lost their mental health. Oh my God, it's hard even to imagine, what they've had to endure, being in battlefield situations, shelled day in, day out, living in cities without electricity and heat. I mean, we wouldn't tolerate this for more than a week in our country, in Britain, if this was happening. We'd be out on the street saying, well, let's call for peace. Let's just have a deal. Let's just end it. Why are we doing this? This is not the 20th century. This is the 21st. Humanity should have moved on, but it hasn't. Make this war end. It's dreadful. That's what I'm hoping for on this kind of fourth anniversary of the starting of this terrible war in Ukraine. And I fear that absolutely none of our leaders are hoping for that too, in the West. And that is shame. Shame on them. Shame on them for sanctioning anybody who speaks out. Shame on them for trying to kind of cancel out voices for peace. Shame on them for sanctioning Jacques Baud and all those other people who've been sanctioned already. Shame on them for inflicting economic harm on their citizens through high energy prices. Shame on them for avoiding responsibility for their role in making this utter disaster happen. Shame on them for the killings, the deaths, and the hundreds of millions that have poured into the bank accounts of defense industrial complex fat cats. Shame on the whole rotten lot of them is what I say. But to you guys listening in, I wish you all peace. Sadly, I don't see it happening anytime soon. But keep listening in, keep supporting my work for as long as I can do it. I'm not quite sure how much longer I can do it, but wherever you are in the world, I wish you very much peace.